Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung, NBC News national enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter, former general counsel of the National Security Agency and senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Glenn Gerstle, and Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman. Full house today. Lisa, the legal stuff. Supreme Court was unanimous. They're rarely unanimous, or at least they're not unanimous on big decisions that folks pay close attention to. And they agreed that Congress was right to do this, or they agree that the law itself is constitutional.
Yes.
If Donald Trump wants to save it, what does he have the legal power to do to save it?
Well, of course, we know that Donald Trump's legal power is sort of itself a complex question in a post-presidential immunity decision world, right? Nothing that he does now might have the same bite with respect to courts' rejections of it that it did before. But that having been said, he principally has sort of two lanes that he could go down, Katie. One would be to issue an executive order, which we understand from other public reporting he's considering. The other would just be to direct the Department of Justice not to enforce it. And were I in Donald Trump's group of advisors, I might suggest the latter rather than the former. And here's why. It's not clear to me that a president does have authority through an executive order to basically make a
say I'm going to ignore the Supreme Court.
Correct.
I mean, wouldn't Joe Biden have done that with the abortion ruling if the president had that sort of authority?
If the president had that sort of authority, there are all sorts of rulings that Joe Biden would have done. But think about it this way. There are laws on the books of Congress that various administrations don't enforce. The Comstock Act is a really good example. Passed in 1873, there are some who interpret it to prohibit the mailing of abortion medications, for example. But we know at the same time that the FDA has approved the lawful use of medication abortion, and the Comstock Act was not enforced by the Biden administration after Roe v. Wade fell. That is a good illustration of the discretion that's afforded to presidents and their departments of justice.
I guess what's different there is that this was a federal law we're talking about, and I guess the president, even if he wanted to overrule the abortion stuff, he can't go state by state. If he wanted to say that he wanted to issue an executive order saying that he's not going to enforce that ban. I want to talk about the national security threats here, because I remember when this thing was being debated, pretty much everybody or most lawmakers, bipartisan, were saying, no way, we can't do this. Joe Biden signed it. I mean, we can't allow TikTok to continue operating as it is. They can get so much data. Also, the mass manipulation aspect of it, I don't think it's discussed enough. The president signed it. Donald Trump at one point thought TikTok was terrible as well. And now I'm just so confused because President Biden is now saying he doesn't really agree with this, even though he signed it. You have a number of Democratic lawmakers who are siding with Donald Trump, who's now saying that they believe that the app should survive. What happened to the national security concerns?
Well, let's take a little walk down memory lane and history lane here. I'll read you a couple of quotes. We're talking about a matter of risk here. It means the ability to control the software, which gives the opportunity to technically compromise the devices, the phones, millions and millions of phones. So we have to sort of step back and say, who is TikTok? Effectively, this person said it's the Chinese government. Who is that person? FBI Director Christopher Wray to Lester Holt, April 23, 2024. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, Joe Biden, just last month. Our intelligence professionals, our national security professionals, not the politician, the professionals, have looked at this and have seen the national security risk. And then the person who painted, in his own words, maybe one of the most stark potential challenges with this app. The data collection threatens to allow the Chinese Communist Party access to Americans' personal and proprietary information, potentially allowing China to track the locations of federal employees and contractors, build dossiers of personal information for blackmail and conduct corporate espionage. That's Donald J. Trump signing an executive order about TikTok, August 2020. So those are the things that these individuals have said. Katie, you might ask, well, in the last 48 hours, has anything changed on this? Has Xi Jinping come out and changed the laws of China? Is there anything that our national and foreign intelligence agencies have come up with that has changed the picture? The answer to that question is absolutely not, because, you know, I've spoken to them.
So I had Congressman Jim Himes on yesterday, and he's the ranking member of House Intel. He voted no on this ban. He's a member of the Gang of Eight. He's seen more intelligence than pretty much anybody in terms of the lawmakers and the politics side of things. Here's how he explained his initial no vote to me.
In virtue of my fact as my position as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. And I make no bones, and I'm not naive at all about what the Chinese might try to do. It is also true that to date, the Chinese have never used TikTok to try to influence an American election or to try to influence an American individual. Now, by the way, we have a much larger conversation to be had about social media's impact on American individuals. But the bottom line for me, and the reason I was a hard no on that bill, was that the federal government has no business telling the American people, the citizens of this country, that, sorry, you don't get to read this media, you don't get to hear this idea, you don't get to use this platform.
So the way that I push back on that is this is not they've said it's not a free speech issue. They just sell the app. The speech is not the problem here. It's not what people are saying on TikTok. It's the way that they can gather up all of our personal information. But I was still surprised to hear that argument from a member of the Gang of Eight. Glenn.
So it's absolutely true that the app presents a significant potential risk, and that's what Congress has talked about, and that's what the government in its briefs in the Supreme Court talked about, which is the potential risk of two things. One, covertly manipulating content on TikTok. Take, for example, the possibility President Xi decides he wants to invade Taiwan in a few months and maybe starts giving an instruction through the Chinese Communist Party to ByteDance to cause the app to slowly have videos that sort of favor the Communist Party's perception of this and against Taiwan, color the American people's view of this. You can envision that. That's one. And the second is siphoning off user data of individuals who use TikTok and sending that to Beijing either for AI training purposes or to build dossiers on people. So those are the risks. They're real risks. But interestingly enough, as the congressman just said in the clip you just showed, neither one of them has in fact materialized. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court said, even though these risks have not materialized in fact, we're going to accept Congress's and the executive's position on this, that just the potential of that is enough to support this. There's
a study that has been done on the perceptions of users on TikTok toward China. This was done in by a professor at Rutgers in coordination with a journal. And they said that they had seen a noticeable change in the warmth that users felt toward China. And they point to a number of videos that the perceptions of the generation below my generation, I guess, Z and maybe younger millennials, is much warmer than in generations past. And their worry, I think the broader worry is that it does change. If Americans change their perceptions of China, China will feel it as more leverage to do things like invade Taiwan. Tom, speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge component of this, right? So there's really two buckets when we talk about TikTok. The first one, and I'll get to it in a second, the personal information. On the algorithm side, it's not just issues on Taiwan, because obviously that's a huge component of this, right? And what China ultimately wants to do with Taiwan. And our perceptions here in the United States towards Taiwan and whether or not we want to, if China does invade, actually involve members of the U.S. military in defending Taiwan. That could be a potentially huge issue, and that issue may not be as far off as some people believe. So that's that. But there are other issues that impact China. We saw the way TikTok reflected certain things with respect to the various wars around the world. And so is there any sort of manipulation as far as what is in China's interest, not necessarily just Taiwan or issues closer to home? The second issue is we've had a debilitating telecommunications attack in the last couple of months that got the call records of the president-elect of the United States. To be sure, the United States is definitely trying to do that type of work to foreign leaders abroad. That's what it is. But China is doing this actively and is aggressive in this space in hacking and getting that content. And the ability for them to target one day Katie Tur, who might want to do a story on China, use any sort of information that might be in your past, myself, that's the type of thing that they have the ability to do, and the guardrails within their society are not nearly what they are here.
There's three things. There's getting into our communications, as you just mentioned, being able to hack into the president-elect's communications. They're now sitting in our power grid, our reservoirs, our water systems. And then if you add this...
all around military bases, I might point out.
And if you add this aspect of software, this manipulation of our opinions, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a national security expert, but when you take those three together, I think as an American, I would be concerned. Jake, I'm going to go to you in a second, Brian, on what's next. But Jake, I want to get the opinion of Congress, because they were pretty overwhelmingly on board with this ban before. Is that still the case?
Yes, I think, well, I think, Katie, we wrote about this at the top of Punchbowl News AM this morning. There does seem to be an appetite to give TikTok a little bit more time to find a buyer. What's interesting to me is that the ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, has effectively said we're not selling. We'll see if that sticks. But even Chuck Schumer said it makes good sense to give a 90-day extension to see if there is a deal. The question is, from a legal point of view, and you guys talked about at the top whether he could do something, Trump could do something by executive order. I don't know about that. But Trump does not come into office until January 20th, and this decision has to be made by January 19th. 19 comes before 20. But I talked to Marco Rubio today in the Capitol, and he said he seemed to think that Trump could still extend this for 90 days. I don't know. This is a law. It's on the books. It's been signed by the president, or by President Biden. So I don't know exactly what he's thinking about. But by and large, people are still Jim Himes, Katie, I want to make this clear to you, and I think you said this. He's in the vast minority, the overwhelming minority of people on Capitol Hill who increasingly say publicly it doesn't make any sense for the United States to allow a foreign government to be on everyone's cell phone, potentially siphoning off information, and Congress should protect the American people and American interests against that.